Next, let's look at the form tag, which is used to gather input from the user and send it to the server. So the form tag has an action, and the action points at the program on the server that will process the data. And in the default format, or in the simplest format, the input elements have names. All right, so a few notes on this. First of all, on the previous slide, I had an absolute URL for the action. This is not common in real life. Typically, you use a relative URL so that you can pick up your entire application and move it to another server, and none of your code has to change. I use an absolute URL just for testing purposes because I'm running a little mini program in Java that reads the input sent from the form and sends back an HTML page that just shows the data that was sent so we can trace what's going on. But in real-life applications, it's typically a relative URL. And speaking of real-life applications, it's not that common to make forms directly. Typically, you use some web application framework that helps you. So, for example, if you're a Java programmer, you may be using JSF or JSF with prime faces, or perhaps Spring MVC. If you're a Microsoft programmer, you're using .NET. You can be using PHP. You can be using Ruby on Rails. There's many other tools for building web applications, and almost all of those have special tags that are specific to that framework. Those tags are interpreted by the server, and they turn behind the scenes into regular HTML form tags, but they turn into form tags that automatically send the data in the format that the framework expects. It inserts certain names or inserts certain attributes into the form so the framework knows how to handle the data and knows what to do with it. So it's not that common that you make a form tag directly. Besides, there are also a lot of applications that don't use forms at all. There are no forms. And that's because they can use AJAX. So AJAX, which is the next topic in jQuery after CSS, is a way of talking to the server, getting some data back, and inserting the result into the page. Now, many applications use a mixture. Some of the updates are done with AJAX, where you stay on the same page and new information arrives, but you also have regular form submissions. But there are other applications, or at least parts of other applications, where it uses only AJAX. And so there are no forms at all, whether they're framework specific or not. So the point of all this is that it's not, for you as a JavaScript front-end developer, it's not really that important that you understand the form tag itself. I'm going to summarize it briefly here because you'll come across it occasionally, and it's a moderately good thing to know. But it's not that critical. What's much more important is the next section, where we look at the various input elements. Because regardless of what framework you're using, and regardless of whether you're doing things with regular form submissions or only with AJAX, you have to know how the form elements work so that you can gather information from the user in a way that is reasonable to the user and in a format that seems natural. Okay, so if I take that previous example, the form that I showed on the slides results in this part of the page. Okay, so if you submit the form, the names that were in the text fields become the first half of each of the pieces of information that appear on the end of the URL. And the entire form submission, the data from the form submission, appears in the URL. And since I'm using this little echo server, it traces what was sent behind the scenes, and what was sent behind the scenes, again, includes the information from the forms. The first half of each piece is the field name. The second half of each piece is the field value. But the key point here is that the information appears in the URL. You can also use post by saying method equals post. The default behavior for a normal HTML form is get. But you can change it to post by saying method equals post. However, many of the frameworks automatically use post, or use post unless you say otherwise. And so in normal HTML, post is not the default. You have to specifically ask for it. But in many of the frameworks, you use a framework-specific tag On the server, that tag expands into a form behind the scenes that automatically uses post. All right, so when you use post, the form looks exactly the same. There's no difference in how it looks to the end user. But when you submit it, the information is not sent on the end of the URL. Instead, the information is sent on a different part of the network request behind the scenes. Well, why do you care? Well, why you care is a long and complicated subject that's really something that server-side programmers talk about more than front-end developers. But a quick summary, if you're sending a password or a credit card number, you don't want it part of the URL because somebody sitting behind the end user could peek over their shoulder and see it when the form is submitted. And post requests also let you send data in other formats like binary data and large amounts of data like image uploads. The big advantage of GET is since the data is part of the URL, it can be bookmarked. So for example, if you do a Google search on the regular Google homepage, the result is a GET request because Google wants you to be able to bookmark the results of doing a search, save that link, click on the link later, bookmark it, send it to someone else, and automatically get the Google search results.